Welcome to another episode of the Your Longevity Blueprint podcast. Today, my guest is Dr. Miles Nichols, who is a functional medicine doctor specializing in Lyme, mold illness, gut, thyroid, and autoimmunity. After Dr. Miles personally struggled with chronic fatigue in his early 20s, Dr. Miles dedicated himself to figure out the root causes. He suffered with and recovered from thyroid dysfunction, autoimmunity, a gut infection, Lyme co-infections, and mold illness. Dr. Miles has authored 2 books, and he founded the Medicine with Heart Functional Medicine Clinic in Colorado, as well as the Medicine with Heart Institute that trains other doctors in functional medicine. Welcome to the show, Dr. Nichols. Did I say that right, Dr. Nichols?
Yeah, and Dr. Mile is fine.
Yeah.
Thanks
Well,
for
as
having me. Looking forward to our conversation today.
well, as I read in your bio, you've been through a lot. So do you briefly want to share in your own words your story, like where you've come from, where you're at now, what you've learned along the way? I know that's a packed question, but
Yeah, I'd love to. Yeah. Growing up, my family was really health focused. My dad, a doctor, also focused on public health. He taught in the public health department of the medical school. He also was became a state legislator and then a state senator. He was really looking to help
cool.
a
Yeah.
lot of people with uh, chronic health conditions, and he passed this piece of legislation. I remember we were driving. It was Tucson, Arizona, so really, really hot. We're driving in it's middle of the day in the summer, and AC is blasting, but sweat's still dripping because it's that hot. And we're sitting there, and I'm like, "Do we have to go?" And he says, "Yeah." And I said, "Why don't we have other people who can do this?" And he says, "Well, if we're going to ask other people to do this, we need to do it ourselves."
Yeah.
And it was going up to random people's houses and knocking on the door and asking for a signature for a petition because he couldn't get something passed in the legislature, and the petition was going to give access to people who fell below the poverty line but who did not have currently at that time access to healthcare. It was going to bridge that gap, and
Very
uh,
cool. Yeah.
and it passed, and it went through, but then it got I'm not going to go through the whole story, but it basically fizzled out due to some issues, and then we had to do the whole thing over again. Just very persistent, a lot of persistence that I learned in the family lineage, and unfortunately, he was under a lot of stress for a lot of reasons. And my mom got a call, and he said, "I think this job is going to kill me," and we didn't
Oh, yeah.
really
Yeah.
take it that seriously. But then I remember getting the call. I was babysitting for my sister's friend and her daughter, and got a call, and it was Claudia from church, and she said, "Something's happened. It's your father." And just a few weeks before, I was out with him looking at cars because my 16th birthday was coming up, and now, he was gone, and it was
Oh,
sudden and unexpected, and I wondered a lot about why top-notch medical training from Stanford Medical School, why top-notch public health training from, Harvard Public Health Masters, and still, why did this happen as a surprise? Why didn't we see it coming? I knew I was under a lot of stress. He did have that sense that that stress was impactful, but uh, it sent me for a loop on what information is valuable, especially when it comes to sudden and unexpected tragedies that might occur, or to preventive and chronic things. That's part of my passion for longevity now, is I want to understand a little bit more about these things that it wasn't like he felt and experienced a lot of chronic illness. I mean, we could probably dig into symptoms and find some, but it's something that I feel like if we had had the kinds of advanced lab diagnostics that we have today, if we'd been able to run a coronary CT angiogram with gluing
right.
analysis, and like, I know how many millimeters of plaque there are and where it is, and tracking that, and that's a very different situation. So I went through my own struggles and health journey in my early 20s, super fatigue, brain fog, migraine headaches, a bunch of unexplained stuff, hard time getting through school. And I didn't get answers from even integrative people that I was seeing, and conventional, just said, maybe you're depressed. And finally, I got a diagnosis from a sleep specialist, but that wasn't a solution. It was a diagnosis to explain rather than a solution. So I became oriented towards how can I solve this? And I got obsessed over that. And I did a lot of stuff over a long period of time, and dove into research, found mentors, figured out a lot of what was going on. And I was so surprised by that process that I decided we need to to create a step-by-step plan for other people to do this because it was not easy. It was a long time. It was just a lot of work to get there. But I feel really good now. Clinic is helping a lot of people. So that's it in a nutshell.
Well said. So I've heard you say live long and die strong is the title for an upcoming book. So what does that mean to you?
There's a lot of people who want to extend lifespan, and lifespan is great, more years, but lifespan isn't the same as health span. And health
Mhm.
span is how many healthy years do we have? And when we look at the research on this, we see that often for a lot of people on average, the last 20% of life is poor quality of life. There's the inability to do what people want. There's a lot of symptoms. There's a lot of struggles, and it's a decline. It's a deterioration. My mom's brother had last 10 years, Alzheimer's was really, really bad. And, I don't, that to me, I don't want to live 10 extra years if I have 10 extra poor quality years. That's
Right.
not the point.
Right.
I'd like, I'd like to die strong. That's the die strong part.
Yes.
I mean,
Yes.
I'd like to live long if I can die strong, but I don't want to live long, weak, and debilitated and, a vegetable or unable to remember people's names. That to me is one of the biggest pieces is there's a importance to quality of life. So sometimes health is spoken about as being free of symptoms, but there's also the enjoyment. I had a friend, we were together we did an outdoor adventure. In college, I did this outdoor adventure thing out in this ranch in New Mexico, beautiful area. We take people out hiking, kayaking, boating, all these things. Director of that program, I mean, amazing guy, attractive, tall, popular, fun, outdoorsy. And over the years, he would call me sometimes, kind of in a spiritual context. He wanted to understand a little bit about spirituality. He knew I was kind of into that. And so we have this relationship. But then I got a call from his family member who said he's committed suicide. And that to me was a
Mhm.
shock because he was in the pinnacle of health physically. But physical health without
Mhm.
happiness, without enjoyment, without quality of both the inner experience, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, as well as physically, isn't worthwhile. So for me, what live long, die strong means is it's that I'd like to extend life as long as that extension comes together. It what I the kind of like catchphrase is healthier, happier, and stronger for longer. It's working to stay healthy, happy, and strong, and get healthier, happier, and stronger over time, and hedge against that there will be some decline. But if, for example, if we over muscle, right, by 20%, then we can account for 20% decline and still be where we want to be to do the things we want to do in those later years. A philosophy, it's a difference in philosophy of being where I want to be for now to being where I want to be and more to give buffer and resiliency towards accounting for possible decline, unexpected things that might arise, so that in those later years there are a buffer that is in place to help to have that cognitive function, metabolic function,
Yeah.
physiologic function, emotional function to get through that time and enjoy it.
Again, well said. That's awesome. I like that thinking and preparing for. I usually tell my patients that too when we're just talking about what are your goals? Like, what do you want to be doing when you're 80? It's like we have to be planning now and preparing now for how we want to be functioning at 80. So I like that you saying we need to account for the natural decline that may happen, but give ourselves that buffer. I love that. So what are some things you call the inevitables that might be getting in the way of our longevity? Maybe expediting that decline.
Well, I mean, it's interesting. There was this study on, unfortunately, a sad study because it was in a war-torn zone and a lot of death in young individuals. But what they did is they autopsied these young individuals and they found that at 15 years old, it was very, very likely to already have fatty streaks. Now, fatty streaks are part
Wow. Yeah.
of this atherosclerotic
Mhm.
process, this process of hardening of plaque in the arteries that takes a long time, a very long time, a lot longer than I think science and clinicians have realized for many years. It's starting now, we understand how early it begins. And so it's when I say the inevitable, it's beginning usually for most people at a very, very young age. There is some now this is cardiovascular, so this is atherosclerosis, so this is plaques in the arteries that can lead to heart attack, that can lead to cardio events later. It doesn't, and unfortunately, the first symptom of this is often an event, and that's an unfortunate piece.
Mhm.
But uh, and with my history with my father, this is really, really important, and
Mhm.
I really want people to understand and know that even if the doctor says your cholesterol looks good, we don't know, and most people, we would assume, and this was autopsy, but we would assume that a lot of these children had normal cholesterol and yet were forming fatty streaks. So we're really understanding that this begins a long time ago. And what I like to redefine rather than the disease process being something that we diagnose and treat once it's a disease process is that we look at these inevitables as a spectrum from optimal function all the way to disease process, and that we are somewhere in that spectrum, and you might be surprised at how far from optimal you are in that spectrum, even when you're still far from disease, given that, for example, 15-year-olds have fatty streaks. So we believe that a lot of people, and we see, and when we test, we find a lot of people are somewhere a lot farther along than they'd like to be, than they thought they were, and that there's possibility to one of two things, either slow the progression or even reverse maybe some of what's going on in relation to that. So one inevitable is cardiovascular
Yes.
atherosclerosis. So that's one of them. Do you want me to go through the list of a few others?
I do, but I'm going to pause you for a second because you alluded to earlier already in the interview that you can scan patients. You mentioned, had your dad have had a coronary calcification scan, maybe you would have known, like there may have been some markers to know that something was happening inside his body. Do you do like CIMT scans on your patients? When you were alluding to the thickness, like
Yeah,
is that something that maybe I'm cutting to the chase and we'll get to this later in the interview, but since we're on the topic.
sure. Yeah. So there are multiple layers. There's obviously
Yeah.
blood testing, and we can go beyond a normal cholesterol test. We can
Hmm.
add a lipoprotein little a, which is an independent
Yes.
risk factor. We can fractionate the things and look at LP particle, or we can look at LDL particles. We can
Hmm.
look at ApoB, and these are going to give us a better sense than just a standard lipid panel. And we can look at inflammatory markers,
Hmm.
LPPLA2. We can look at the HSCRP and others, homocysteine. These can give us a sense for the inflammatory and oxidative processes that go together with
Hmm.
the lipid process. And that's one area that a lot of people can do easily and simply with a blood test. Then we
Hmm.
can look at uh, a next layer, which would be either a calcium score or CIMT. And a
Hmm.
CIMT is a carotid. So the carotid artery, it's an ultrasound that looks at the thickness, and it looks at soft and or hard plaque formation in the carotid artery specifically.
Which
Carotids are a
should
good,
be reflective of what's happening in the heart, right? That's the
it,
theory. Yeah, yeah,
yeah,
yeah, yeah. Yeah.
it's a good proxy to
Yes.
estimate what's happening. Now, if we really want to be very accurate about what's happening and get the top of the gold standard, then we do a CCT angiogram, a coronary CT angiogram, and then there's an AI analysis. AI technology is incredible now. It's called Clearly, and that AI analysis gives us very detailed. We can look at each artery coming off the heart. So basically, chest area, we get the different arteries, and we can see the blood flow. We can see if there's stenoses or occlusion in that blood flow. We can see by how much percent. We can see millimeters of
Mhm.
plaque, whether it's soft, whether it's hard. That's the gold standard here now for what we can do if warranted. We really like to do that as a longevity screen.
Yeah.
That'll give us the most accurate sense. But if we can't get that for whatever reason, then CIMT is fantastic and another one that we'll do. And also blood analysis and or calcium score are on the table as possibilities as well.
Awesome. I've had one other guest mention the Clearly, but I didn't realize that incorporated AI. So that's like cool. And maybe we'll come back to some of this, but I know there's just so much more I want to get to. So let's move on from the heart to some of the other inevitables.
Yeah, so when we're talking heart, that's the big one is
Yes.
atherosclerosis. There are, of course, others to consider. And then with brain is probably one of the next big ones that people want to understand and know more about because, of course, the cognitive decline issue, it's growing. It's growing at a rapid rate, even while cardiovascular issues declined a little when we look at like the from 2000 until now. The Alzheimer dementia rates have been going up dramatically and significantly. And it's now more than 1 in 3 seniors dies with an Alzheimer's or dementia in their brain when they die. And that's just shocking at this
Yeah.
point. The Alzheimer's Association is publishing some very interesting data. Most clinicians don't even know the early signs of mild cognitive impairment, let alone the public. And so we're dealing with a situation where there aren't easy and simple. I mean, there are blood tests. Most people don't know about them. Most people aren't running them. So they're, cognitive assessments, neurocognitive assessments, and getting that spectrum of where do we lie with the inevitable of the brain deterioration over time. So it's another one that typically on average we can track MRIs of the brain, and we know that the hippocampal region, the memory center, it does atrophy over years. So if we look at what's the average,
Sure.
so MRI, there are AI analysis as well, called the neuroquant. And if we do AI
Okay.
analysis called the neuroquant on an MRI
Mhm.
of the brain, we do see that there are age match control ranges, and we do see that hippocampal volume getting smaller and smaller and smaller as people age on average. Now, that doesn't mean that it can't go flat or even increase in volume in some individuals. We do see that. And that's where we can intervene. That's where there are some things that can be done. We can really see a little bit about the structure of the brain, the function of the brain, and do some things and improve that.
What does a neuroquant cost? What-
So the good news about a brain MRI is
Yeah.
often insurance pays for brain MRIs if there are
Yep.
symptoms to warrant it and someone has insurance and there's an appropriate referral. So that's
Sure, sure.
sometimes people can get that. And the NeuroQuant is really a software
That
that
sure.
some imaging centers are licensed to use and some are not. So what we do is we just help to point the person towards an imaging center that's licensed to use NeuroQuant when they're getting their insurance-based MRI, and then maybe we can get NeuroQuant covered. If not, then out here it varies all over the country, but out here in Colorado, roughly 450 or so out of pocket if someone's not going through insurance to get a brain MRI with NeuroQuant.
Sure, sure. What are some of the blood markers that you were saying that can, yeah, maybe tell
Yeah,
us if
so
there's some cognitive decline? Yeah.
yeah, I mean, and some of these are pretty new too and newly available, so they're exciting and what's happening. So, beta amyloid plaque is the plaque that we know that starts to increase as over time. And there's a blood marker that looks at a ratio. It used to be that to get an accurate sense for beta amyloid, there had to be more of a like cerebral spinal fluid, which a spinal tap is not fun and not recommended for a
Yeah.
preventive screen. So we're now just recently there's been a validated test. LabCorp Quest do it. These big labs tend to do it. That is looking at a beta amyloid 42/40 ratio, and that
Hmm.
ratio tells us a pretty good proxy for the more invasive tests now. So that's one. Tau protein is another. So there's a tau protein test in the blood as well. And neurofilament light chain is the third that
Hmm.
we'll use. So there is a panel, for example, through LabCorp called ATN, and that's all three of those. And that's
Hmm.
one of the good choice panels that we'll use as a preventive screen in relation to cognitive decline. Any one of those markers is great. All three together gives us a pretty good picture and can be helpful. And then the MRI of the brain with neuroquants is another that we really like to screen. And then there are some functional screens that people can do online that VNS there's a set of questions that can test things like memory and cognitive function, executive function, and things like that. CNSVS, I believe, is the name of one of those that are used, and there's a bunch of others that are used as well that are similar, where you do an online cognitive assessment.
Sure. Awesome. I've never ordered that panel. I'm gonna have to look into that ATN panel. So I'm assuming you don't want any of those blood tests positive, right? You don't want any of those in your.
Exactly. And if you do, then if we do, even if there aren't symptoms, we want to dig a little deeper. We want to understand more, and we want to see if we can. And that's the sweet spot. That's the best place. I mean, it's not good that they're elevated, but it's the best place to be in the sense that if it's before there's a diagnosis, before there are significant symptoms, we see a process that could lead to those significant symptoms later. That's the sweet spot for when to start to do some things. And I mean,
Yeah.
ideally we start doing things before, but
Right,
but we
right, right.
really get intensive and know to do more.
Sure, sure. Okay. So you have the heart and the brain. What about some other inevitables?
We have the cells, of course. Cancers are one of the big ones that are going to it's sort of like there's cancer cells being formed throughout life, but the body disposes and takes care of them, so don't grow into a diagnosable cancer or something that would be problematic. But there's always this turnover of cells, and the cellular turnover process can become, again, deterioration over time. And there's a genetic predisposition issue. So if there's more likelihood than uh, genetically, then it might happen earlier, but it's just a process that occurs probably for most everyone at some point. So it's sort of the reason inevitables is used. It's like if you don't die of an accident or an infection or something that's a little bit more acute and traumatic, if you survive long enough,
Yeah.
then one of these is
Is going
likely to yes,
totally. Yeah.
these are the ones that are coming eventually if you live long enough to experience them. And but I don't want to say they're inevitable in the sense that there's nothing you can do about them. There's a lot that we can do about them. So the cellular, there are some new advanced diagnostics, early screens from multi cancer screens. For example, the Gallery is one
Yep.
test that
We offer that
that
one.
that's
Yep. Yep.
and then there's of course other markers that and preventive tests that people can do to assess likelihood. And then there's whole genome sequencing has come a long way. Whole genome sequencing allows for basically the sequencing of the whole genome. Not all of it is known. We don't know what it all means, but when we can sequence it all, as new data comes out, we can start to associate. So if there's new data that comes out that associates a certain gene predisposition with greater likelihood of a certain kind of cancer, that actually can get updated as information that updates over time. And that can inform the kinds of screening recommendations and prioritization for those screening recommendations and help establish a bit of a risk profile for someone. And my mom, unfortunately, and her mom both had cancer in their later years. And so of course that's meaningful to me as well in my own journey. So I'm
Yeah.
looking at what do we know about this, and what do we know about the things that can potentially be triggers or be help this process become worse over time. So there are environmental exposures, there are chemical exposures, there's a lot of things that have been classed as carcinogens, and a lot of things that haven't, but that probably
Should be.
further the chances for having issues in the future.
Sure. You mentioned earlier the importance of muscle. Like if we can double our muscle, right? The more muscle we have, the longer we're going to live. So like with the inevitables, where does muscle? I want to come back to that. Where would that fall here? Like
Yeah, so we have
as
the
far as
brain, the
maybe
heart.
the lack of muscle. Maybe I should.
Yeah, yeah. So we have the brain, the heart, the cells. Now we're moving on to the
Mhm.
body composition, and that, of course, the structure, the body composition. Well, in and of itself, we wouldn't say that that's the cause of death for many people. What we would say is the cause of death is a fall leading to a fracture, leading to a hospitalization, leading to being subjected to, let's say, an infection like pneumonia. And then the if we trace it back, what was the initiating thing that occurred to get the person immobile, to get the immune system down, to get them the infection that they couldn't handle or deal with? The fall, the fracture was due to typically undermuscled and bone density issues. So when we're looking at the structure, the stats aren't great either on sarcopenia. By the time someone's 80 years old, it's very, very likely that 2 in 5 or even a slightly more than that are going to be sarcopenic. Sarcopenia means lower than healthy muscle mass. We like to do DEXA body composition for charting this from an early age. DEXA, the same thing that measures bone density, also has the capacity to look at lean body mass and fat and give us very, very good detailed information about grams of fat, visceral adipose tissue, which is the more problematic kind of ratio of the different fat areas, and whether there's more belly fat versus fat in other areas that have different risk profiles associated with them, and how much muscle there is. And so with that information, we can establish goals in a much better way than just the weight on a scale. Because the weight on a scale doesn't tell us how muscled
Mhm.
versus fat. And it
Right.
doesn't give us a sense for, sometimes people, I mean, especially I'm pretty concerned about the fact that a lot of people are using GLP-1s like Ozempic and others to lower fat without getting DEXA body comp, without knowing how much muscle and or bone density are being lowered. And that concerns me. And I really think that it's important,
Hmm.
especially for someone who's trying to lose weight, that they understand the composition dimension of that and not just the scale. That's so
Yep.
important because you could
Yep.
inadvertently put yourself in a position that increases risk. And on average, after 30, people are losing muscle mass every decade,
Hmm.
6 point some percent, every decade after age 30, which is also highly concerning that 30 is the peak for most people. Now, that doesn't have to be. People can start weightlifting, people can start doing certain diet and
Of
lifestyle
course. Yeah,
interventions,
yeah.
but yeah,
Wait, so I totally agree with you. We do offer the GLP-1s for patients here, but rather than send them for a DEXA, which is fancier, we have the in-body screening here in clinic. So we can at least assess their baseline fat and muscle because the number doesn't tell the whole story. Like sometimes patients think I'm not losing weight, but they actually are losing weight. They have lost some fat, but we want to make sure they're not just losing muscle mass along the way. So yeah, we have a separate sort of screening, again, not as fancy as the DEXA, but the in-body scan for our patients who are listening can assess also what Dr. Miles is talking about. So
yeah,
I
and that's
agree.
another great way to assess the body composition. It's not the gold standard. DEXA body comp is the gold standard, but
Yep.
it's actually got some trials that place it pretty close to the gold standard. And of course, um, it's a little less expensive and easier to run on yourself than going and getting a DEXA body comp. So it is a great solution
Yep.
for some individuals. And GLP-1s can be fantastic and helpful for people when we understand that the muscle mass is important, the bone density is
Mhm.
important, it's being monitored and tracked. So kudos to you for tracking that and doing it in that way. That's kind of the right way to do it, I believe.
Totally, because I do think most clinics just give patients GLP-1s and send them on their way, and that
Yeah.
can be a bad thing. So yes. Okay, what else? For inevitables. Any
Yeah,
more?
so we have so far we have the heart, the brain,
Brain.
we have the body, we have the cells. And then last one I'll sort of highlight here. I mean, and there are more, but last one I'll highlight is the engine, sort of the metabolism, the metabolic impact. Now, that's going to impact all these other things. It's going to impact body comp. It's going to impact
Hmm.
cardiovascular risk. But of
Yeah.
course, the metabolism, the metabolic process, the engine, the energy producing mitochondria are going to be a big one that are going to contribute. Metabolic diseases are certainly ones that we see also impacting lifespan, health span, quality of life. I remember it was Christmas. I was coming home, and my one of the family members, I won't say who, but one of the family members had a relative, a father, that was they didn't come, and I said, why didn't you come? And she said, well, I have to be there for my father's surgery. He's getting an amputation, and so there's a leg amputation for uncontrolled diabetes. Now the data is insane. It's insane on blood sugar dysregulation, even mild blood sugar dysregulation that never gets diagnosed as prediabetes or diabetes, and how much of an issue there is with insulin resistance, with we have people wear CGMs, continuous glucose monitors, and it is so surprising how someone who said, "Oh, my blood sugar is always normal. I always get it checked. It's always great. The doctor says it's perfect, no issues," and that we see meals that are issues, and we see spikes that are above 140, and we know that even one spike above 140 is potentially can be damaging to parts of the body, and we understand that these advanced glycated end products are highly problematic for eyes, for kidney, for other organ systems, and we really want people to understand a little better about how they respond to individual meals and not just their average blood sugar. That's really important. Also, where their insulin lies, because we see a lot of blood sugar
Yes.
normals
Yep.
with insulin resistance, where fasting insulin is elevated. And then we also see issues where blood sugar, insulin, and continuous glucose monitor all look normal and good in response to meals, but the average is a little high. So the average is not in our optimal range of 70 to 100 for an average blood sugar over time. And so there's still probably a load that's problematic. And then even some people who are in that normal there still have metabolic issues that manifest differently, maybe ATP production, mitochondrial issues that are contributing to disease processes. We now know that Parkinson's has a big mitochondrial relationship. We now know that a number of other the list keeps growing on the number of disease processes that have a mitochondrial and metabolic root, and it's not always the obvious ones that people think of. And so
Sure.
the engine breakdown over time is the other one that we want to assess, not only the blood sugar component of, but the energy production and mitochondrial status as well.
Yeah, that's good. Let me go back to glucose. So it'd be nice if I could get every single patient to wear CGM. I haven't got every single patient to do that, but but for the listeners, what is your goal? Like you mentioned, you want average glucose numbers to range between 70 and 100. What is your goal for hemoglobin A1C and for fasting insulin?
So it's a little tricky because hemoglobin A1C does differ based in part on how long the red blood cells live. People with thalassemias and certain other conditions might actually have a false hemoglobin A1C, which is part of why I like to do continuous glucose monitoring because
Sure.
it gives us a more accurate sense. But certainly on average, for most people, assuming that the red blood cells are living for the
90,
normal-ish
yeah.
amount of time, then we'd like to see in the low fives or high fours. We certainly want to see less than 5.4. And if we're stricter, even less than 5.1 would be in sort of what we consider more an optimal. And and so that average that's not going on average above 100 is kind of where we're targeting that. And they estimate that from a hemoglobin A1C.
But yet
And
most
then,
doctors say, I mean, I still have patients who their primary care says, as long as you're under 7, you're fine. Or
right.
6.5 is fine. Fine is
Yeah.
different than optimal, right? So back to the inevitables. If you want to
Exactly.
avoid some of the inevitables, Dr. Miles is saying actually an A1C less than 5. So at least low fives, high fours is the best place to be. I just want to clarify that because I feel like there's just a huge discrepancy on where A1C should be.
Yeah, and the what I believe based on the data so far, and of course this evolves over time, but I believe that people are damaging themselves slowly, subtly over time, but damaging themselves unknowingly with what's considered to be and told to them to be a completely normal blood sugar, and that their actual advanced glycated end products from blood sugar are damaging them slowly over time. And it
Yeah,
is
yeah,
creating problems.
sure.
And it contributes to neurologic. So we know that Alzheimer dementia have,
Hmm.
in many cases, an insulin resistance issue in the brain itself, even if the blood is normal. And it can contribute to cardiovascular issues. And it can contribute to cancers and the metabolic processes involved in those. So it relates and it can contribute to fat deposition and body composition changes. So it contributes to all of the other ones. It's kind
Yep.
of one of those big underpinning things that people don't realize that their metabolism is what we would call hypometabolism, sluggish, or that they have a little bit of metabolic acidosis. They're not clearing lactic acid appropriately. That's creating damage over time. And the blood sugar piece and the insulin piece is creating damage over time. And a lot of people don't realize that that damage is happening. No one's telling them that damage is happening. And yet it's furthering all of these inevitable.
Yikes. Okay, insulin. What's your perfect insulin, in your opinion?
I
Perfect
like two to
fat
five.
fasting insulin. Yep, yep, that's what I tell patients
I
too.
like two
Yeah.
to five. I don't mind less than two in some cases, especially certain diets and things like that. But if we go less than two, then I like to make sure thyroid is okay because TSH can be impacted, and HPA axis, the adrenal axis function, is okay because
Yep.
when insulin's actually a weak stimulator of thyroid, not just TSH. Thyroid stimulating hormone is, of course, the
Hmm.
strong stimulator of thyroid. But when we have thyroid symptoms, thyroid issues, too low in insulin, mixed bag. But
Sure.
2 to 5 is my optimal range for most people.
Sure. That's usually what I say to all those 6. I remember hearing somewhere one year at A4M that a perfect insulin is 6 or less, not too low. But generally speaking, that's what I've been telling my patients too.
Not going to
I
quabble too much about a 6.
I was next going to ask how you measure or test for kind of where you stand on those inevitables, but we kind of already went through that as we were talking about those. So let's go on to what are
I can
some.
I,
Oh,
I could categorize just briefly
yeah,
if
yeah.
that's helpful. Like
Sure, sure.
so I think there's imaging, and the imaging, especially with AI analysis, has come a long way. So this is going to be our CCT angiogram, our CIMT ultrasound. This is going to be our DEXA body comp is an imaging category. This is going to
Yeah.
be our MRI of the brain. So So these imaging is one category where you can get a ton of data and information. So that's think of that as its own category, and especially with
Yep.
AI analysis, fantastic information that we're gathering that we might not be able to find any other way. Genetics and epigenetic expression give us a little bit of that predisposition, what to watch out for, what to look more deeply at,
Mhm.
especially with whole genome sequencing and the gene expression. So there are transcriptomics and DNA methylation tests that look at the transcription of the genes or the expression of the genes or how turned up or turned down or activated the genes are. And that's a whole different than the genetics themselves, and that's come a long way. There's a gene expression test that's unbelievable. It just gets so much data and information. It tells us a lot about metabolism, a lot about insulin, a lot about inflammation, which we know inflammaging is part of the
Mhm.
process. And it tells us a lot about, there's a fingerprint of gene expression for Parkinson's that we've identified, so we can probably have early detection of if someone's heading in that direction.
What test is this that you talk about? What test is this?
Yes, this is by Protein DX. It's called the
Okay.
Genie, and
Okay.
it's a, I mean, not a ton of people are running it because it is not inexpensive and it's very complicated. But I mean, when we can get mitochondrial genes, ribosomal genes, and see if they're downregulated, when we can get, you know, IRS2, which is one of the insulin genes, see if it's upregulated, HIF1 alpha, which is about hypoxia, so low oxygen. We can see if there are oxygenation issues with gene expression, fingerprint for Parkinson's, lots of inflammatory upregulations or downregulations. It's so useful. And so I love it. It's an amazing one. And
Okay.
so
Oh, yeah,
so
continue.
we have the imaging category, we have the genetics epigenetics category, and then we have the
Okay.
microbiome category. Yeah.
I actually want to pause you really quick, just because I want to go back to, I know you were talking about gene expression, but because we are talking about some of the inevitables again in heart disease and cardiovascular disease, I'm sorry, heart disease and um, brain disease like Alzheimer's, whatnot. Can you mention the ApoE4 genotype
Yeah. Yeah.
and any of your, I mean, for some of my patients, it seems discouraging. I mean, I have a lot of patients who have that. And eh, although I'm trying to advise them and encourage them that this is healthy, beneficial information for us, can I get some of your tips on when you discover that with some of your patients, how you approach that? I know you could do probably a whole podcast on that, but like, what are your top tips for someone who does discover that they have an ApoE4 genotype?
Yeah, and as I mentioned earlier, mom's brother had
Yeah,
Alzheimer's, so I know
yeah.
it's in the lines. Of course, I tested my own genetics, and I do have one ApoE4. I have one
Do you? Yeah,
ApoE2, which two
yeah.
kind of offsets a little bit the four.
Sure,
It's
sure.
a little lower risk, four is a little higher risk, but still we don't know which is expressing, and how much of each. And so there's certainly something that I'm paying a lot of attention to. There's a whole big white paper on ApoE that we use in the clinic, and we sometimes send to patients if they really want to dive deep. But I mean, the high level of it is exercise is number one, mitigating the risk from the data that we see so far. If we get a great exercise plan, we see that the increased risk may be offset almost completely.
Wow.
So that's a big one. And then,
Mhm.
of course, we're looking at and monitoring because ApoE not only for neurologic, it's also going to potentially relate to cardiovascular. So we're going to really want to monitor both neurologic and cardiovascular a little earlier, a little more aggressively, and work to get those markers a little more tucked into their optimized levels so that we, might do an ATN earlier in that case. We might do some of the screenings earlier in that case.
Yeah,
And we might
yeah. Good
also
point. Yeah.
and then we might, be paying attention, a lot of attention to the signs of mild cognitive impairment and be looking for those and be working on those. We don't want to freak people out. So it's this fine balance of, you know, when you focus on something too much, you can actually like
Mhm.
make it bigger than it is.
Mhm.
So it's this fine balance of helping people to understand, where they are, where they could go, what the risk, but not over freaking out about the risk, but doing proactive and preventive things. And exercise, number one, of course, diet and lifestyle, stress management, really important. Sleep, incredibly, incredibly important to get sleep dialed and to screen. Please screen for sleep apnea if you have not, and you're in that higher risk for something like a neurodegenerative. Very important. find people who don't snore, people who don't have, people who aren't overweight, aren't having a lot of alcohol, don't meet the criteria to get tested or screened usually, who think they're sleeping well, still with apnea. It is not uncommon. Please do screen for that.
Awesome. Okay. So I cut you off. You're about to go to the microbiome, I think,
Yeah, yeah,
or
yeah.
biome
So,
something.
yeah. Yeah, so we have the imaging, the genetics, epigenetics,
Mhm.
now the microbiome. So, and this is beyond the gut microbiome. So the gut microbiome important. So we'll do things like SIBO breath tests, stool analyses to look at that gut microbiome. Now there are whole genome sequencing. We can get a lot of data and information, but it's not only about that. It's also about, for example, the sinus biome or the rhinobiome is what it's called. And we do sinus swabs and we see all the time that there's a bacteria here. Sometimes we see the same bacteria here as is in the stool. So, for example, we know that Klebsiella is one bacteria that can be associated with certain autoimmune issues and
Mhm.
can contribute to problems in the body. It can also overgrow and contribute to bacterial overgrowth in the small intestine. Uh, uh, just earlier today, looked at a sinus swab, saw Klebsiella in a patient, and sometimes we'll see on a gut, Klebsiella is elevated, and on the sinus it's elevated. And the problem is they've gone to providers before who have done stool analyses, looked at the gut, treated it, and the person feels better for a little while and then worse, treated. And so this person, this individual, had been treated a bunch of times for gut stuff, and it didn't hold, and it hasn't made the lasting difference. When we
They
found
never
in the
treat.
sinuses, I
Yeah.
said, okay, it might be dripping down, and maybe the stomach acid isn't adequate to kill it off, and it's getting in the intestines, and it's re-inoculating. And so I like to look at the rhinobiome, the oral biome, the gut biome, and the skin biome. Uh, Inevitably, and so in some cases, vaginal biome. These are important to look at. We don't need to look at all of them for everyone, although if we were to design the kind of live long, die strong program that I really want people to have, then it would include a full assessment and would look at skin and does look at skin, rhinobiome, oral biome, and gut biome. So if we can look at those all, and we're seeing a lot on the skin biome of these certain gram-positive bacteria called actinomycetes. And these class of bacteria, there's some recent papers that are coming out showing that they transport cell to cell toxin transport through extracellular vesicles that are big inflammatory burden and trigger for a number of people. And that is early, but it's coming in, and we're seeing that and in some people, I found that we find these bacteria in a dust swab in their home and on a skin sample colonizing their skin. And in a couple of cases, we've even found in the semen,
Oh my
so it's
gosh. Yeah.
it's actually
Yeah.
now in the body, this
Seated
bacteria
in
that.
their body. Oh my gosh. Yeah. That's
So,
crazy.
so,
Yeah.
so biome screening can help
Yeah.
give us, I mean, if we know what to do with it, a sense for how to take a look, because we just have so much data on microbiome connections and biome connections and
Mhm.
bacterial connections and fungal connections to different parts of health and all these other factors in the body. So that screening is really important, I believe, to be a part of it. And then we have our blood chemistry, and we have our nutrient status as sort of, and mitochondrial status, and all our blood sugar, and metabolic testing, and these, blood tests that we've talked about that can be helpful. Sometimes we add in some urine testing to help with organic acids and look at methylation, mitochondrial function. Sometimes a buccal swab, of a salivary swab, to look for mitochondrial function of the four respiratory chains individually and see how those are doing. So there's a bunch. I mean, we can go on and on, but just to give people broad
Yeah. Oh
categories:
yeah.
imaging, genetics, epigenetics, microbiome, and then nutrient methylation, blood, different, like, detailed things in that category, just to sort of
Yeah.
get the high level of it.
Yeah. Very few of which does a conventional doc ever order, just to point out.
Right.
So what are some of your other favorite interventions? Maybe once you've established, someone's risk, you've looked at some of these inevitables, with the patient. So when you're personalizing a approach for this patient, what are some of your favorite interventions, simple and more complex?
I mean, first, the basics are so important, but most people who come to see me have addressed those pretty thoroughly. But, if someone's on standard American diet, if their blood sugar is spiking on CGM, if they're having things that, if they're not getting enough sleep, if they're not managing stress, these are the core foundations of sleep, stress, nutrition, um, lifestyle variables that most of the time when people come see me in our clinic, they've already dialed a lot of these things in. They've already been taking a base level of supplementation. They've already done some gut treatments. They've already changed their diet a bunch of times and tried to figure out what's best for them. They are already tracking their sleep and getting pretty good sleep. So let's just assume that people have addressed those basics. If they haven't, then the basics first are really important. But let's assume that someone's addressed the basics. Then what we're finding at that point is that, I mean, targeted, if we, so cleaning the environment up is a big one that we see. I mean, the exposures are unbelievable. I have another book that's in the works about microplastics and nanoplastics, a whole book on it, because we just see an incredible amount of accumulation in tissue, in brains, in kidneys, in livers. There's a lot of microplastic that is in almost everyone's tissue. There's a lot that's coming out in urine when we measure urine. An alarming amount. Paper showed 5 grams a week, which is about the equivalent of a credit card worth of plastics coming out as micro and nanoplastics in a week's time. Endocrine disrupting chemicals in
Yeah.
these plastics, and a big problem.
So
So
where are we
environment,
getting? Yeah, so I get the environment, but specifically, where are we getting exposed to plastics? Like the obvious is if you're
yeah.
drinking out of a plastic water bottle, but like where else are we getting these
Well,
plastics?
tap water even, and so water
Yeah.
is actually the biggest one, and including tap water. And in the U.S., it's not even much better than when we look at U.S. versus India or other places that we would think. It's it's bad all over, basically. It's any tap water that studies looked at a lot of different tap water in a lot of different countries, and essentially tap water is a huge source, unfortunately, probably the biggest source for most people. Now, there's a
Okay.
bunch of other sources, but if and this means that all the products that are made with water, are all the coffee and the tea and the bottled beverages and the alcohol and everything, really now all of that is suspect. And
Yeah.
it's hard to remove. It's hard to remove with filtration. You need very, very fine filtration to remove it. So like something like reverse osmosis will remove it. Of course, there are plastic parts and it puts a tiny bit of plastic back in, but it's going to dramatically reduce the microplastics in water. So if people are diligent about drinking water that's been appropriately filtered, which is hard, but appropriately filtered to
Mhm.
reduce or eliminate almost all the microplastic, that's probably
The
the number
best.
one
Yeah, sure.
the number one. And then, heat makes it worse and fermentation makes it worse. So you think about getting your coffee in, which seems like it's in a cup that's a paper cup, but it's lined with a little plastic on the inside. And then the lid is this thin plastic. And then all the steam is coming up. And then we see significant increases with heat exposure together with plastic and with acidic or fermentation. So any fermented product that comes in plastic is also going to leach more of that plastic into that product. So it's unavoidable that I mean, almost almost unavoidable, but yeah, if people can, I mean, if they can clean up their air, clean up their water, clean up the environment. I can't tell you how many homes are making people sick. It's just unbelievable, and people don't know it. Even when there's not mold, it's a whole nother topic for
Something.
another
Yeah.
day. But
Yeah. Yeah.
homes really making people sick, chemicals exposures, plastic exposures. So clean your air, clean your water, and clean your home, and really make that a priority. I think is a weak point for a lot of people and could go a ton, just a huge way. And then a simple self-awareness practice, because a lot of this, if we're not aware, how do we do anything about it? So
Mhm.
so I think one of the main biggest things that for a lot of people they can get benefit from is a self-awareness practice. That can be meditation, that can be breath work, that can be cold exposure, that can be a combination of these kinds of things. We like to encourage people to experiment with different things and combine them together. But some way of cultivating interoception and cultivating self-awareness and cultivating an understanding of your body, your emotions, your thoughts, the deeper awareness of something bigger than all of that, a connection to something bigger than all of that. and an inner sense, if people can, and this gets a little out there, but if people can find that sense inside of being whole and complete with what is as it is, even if there's illness, even if there's struggle, even if there's, I believe, and I think a lot of people believe that there is a part of us that is completely unbroken, completely whole, completely untouched by the externals. And I think if we can find that part, build that part, cultivate that part, that's one of the best things that people can do, because then you approach whatever in life, and we're all going to forget and get lost and have to keep doing practice to remember this. But when we can connect with that part of us that's full of love and care and content with what is as it is, even if there's goals and preferences for the future that we want to be better than it is, that if there can be a base level of contentment and peace, that from there, I think everything else just works so better, and the quality of life is so much better. I really, really work hard with people together to do what we can to, rather than coming at a situation, especially a chronic health concern, from why am I like this? Why can't I feel better? I just really want this. Other people are living their lives worse than I'm living my life, and yet they feel better than I. And it just builds this negative complex. And we do these applied gratitude practices, breath practices, meditation practices to help find this stability, this inner sense of an unshakableness and an unbroken dimension inside. And if we can find that dimension and then work from there, and have gratitude for where we are and that we're not worse than where we are, and to feel that we're coming from that place in working on health goals and working on longevity, working on everything else, I think does I mean, if if there were one thing, I might say that's the one thing, but it's just hard. It's hard to convey that exactly.
You have a special practice if you're teaching your patients that and you're running all these advanced tests. Like you have, your patients are, they better be thankful. No, I'm just kidding. You're doing a lot. I have to go back and ask though, how do we get the microplastics out? You said they're so hard to detoxify. I mean, does sauna help get rid of plastics? Like what?
The unfortunate answer is we don't know from a database perspective. I
Mm.
have lots of theories about how we might do that. And those theories are based on some data, but not microplastics data specifically. There has recently been a blood test for microplastics that is now available. So now we can measure, now we can start to get data and collect that data and know what's reducing the burden. The certainly reducing exposure is number one thing that everyone can reduce exposure.
Right.
And then of course the body will have its own natural detoxification processes, but a lot might be lodged in tissue. What do we do about that? I think there are ways. I mean, we know there are ways to exchange fats with cells, so we know that we can, cell membranes can uptake phosphatidylcholine and can
Mhm.
uptake certain saturated fatty acids and then push out what's in there. And maybe pushing out what's in there might be helpful in removing
Mhm.
some. So I think fatty acid exchange is probably one. Uh, Intercellular detoxification. This is kind of sometimes referred to as phase three. It's these transport proteins that take toxin from in the cell out. Autophagy and fasting may play a role in this, in purging cells from some of these
Sure.
uh, stored things. So there's a bunch that we have as theoretical to help to reduce the burden. I can't say that we have data yet, but I'm hoping that we will soon.
I could talk to you for another hour, but I'll have to wrap up the show here. So I want to ask two more questions. What would a second common environmental toxin that you see be? So obviously plastics, you kind of alluded to our houses could be making us sick. So do you feel like mold is another major environmental toxin, or what do you see next most
Yeah, when it
commonly?
comes to yeah, when it
Yeah,
comes to homes and water damage or damp conditions in homes, mold is of course a severe and problematic issue, and it's rampant. The EPA estimates that 1 in 4 to as much as even 1 in 2 U.S. American homes may have damp conditions that are conducive to growth of organisms, and those organisms aren't always mold. I would say that mold is under, well, so I'd say I'd say the home making people sick is completely underappreciated and valued. Mold is maybe over emphasized in the main things that are making people sick. We see we see actually gram-negative bacteria that produce endotoxin being breathed in, and those growing, especially in certain conditions where there's dirt or sewage or other things of that nature. Although even in some clean homes, we see it occasionally. And then the much more common are that class I referred to them earlier, actinomycetes.
Hmm.
These are things like Corynebacterium, Tuberculosdericum, Propionibacterium acnes are the two that are most researched at this point that we look out for in the dust of a home. There are also glucans that are produced by some fungal organisms that are not molds, and those glucans breathed in may also contribute to inflammation and immune triggering in a lot of people. But the probably the number one that I think is important is the actinomycetes, and that's because it can grow fairly easily in homes. It's natural in soils, but there are soil habitat and human habitat actinos, and the human habitat actinos can colonize the skin, and we're now even finding it in semen in some cases. It's rare in blood and the gut, but it may even be there are some cases of getting in the blood, getting in the gut. So it's much more common to be on the skin and in the environment. The good news is that we don't have to do as significant of a remediation or moving as we do with mold. Mold is very, very virulent, gets into the porous materials, has to be remediated in a very detailed way. It's not done right a lot of the time, unfortunately. But actinomycetes, the good news is they don't tend to permeate into the porous materials in the same way. A lot easier to clean, and people can often do that process. It's an intensive process, but they can either do it themselves or hire cleaning companies to help out without. I mean, ideally, they have an indoor air professional, an indoor environmental professional. That's the best case scenario. But if they can't, for whatever reason, we're finding that a lot of people are able to mitigate and manage it on their own or with a team of cleaners.
Awesome. Okay. You've covered so much. I have to ask you about Lyme before we wrap up the show, just because you've personally experienced it. So why do you think Lyme is so often missed? And is there anything specific that you do differently for Lyme disease? Again, we could have a whole podcast on that, but maybe something that you could give us maybe some clinical pearl that shifted things in the right direction in your situation. Any just tips for the listeners on Lyme with the few minutes we have
Yeah,
left?
yeah. So,
Loaded
so
question. Yeah.
yeah. I mean, Borrelia burgdorferi, the bacteria that causes Lyme, is an interesting one. I've spent a lot of time looking at it. It's in a class of bacteria called spirochetes. We have other weird things in that class like leptospirosis and syphilis and diseases that are odd and I mean the whole term Herxheimer reaction, which is like a detox reaction,
Mhm.
negative reaction to treatment, emerged out of a spirochetal infection. Originally, it was syphilis, and it was discovered that treating it led to worse symptoms sometimes before people got better. And so spirochetes have very strange properties, and Borrelia burgdorferi that causes Lyme is on the rise every year. CDC ups the estimates for how many people are infected each year. And there are a lot of organizations like the Bay Area Lyme Foundation is finding, on the West Coast and near the beaches, a lot of Lyme containing ticks. So it's coast to coast and it's different in different areas, but it's we know it. These can lodge on songbirds and get dropped. These ticks and that the transmission is, probably one study came out that showed 1 in 7 worldwide seropositive for Lyme, and based on not the strictest but fairly strict criteria for that blood analysis, 1 in 7 worldwide. That's incredible to
Yeah.
see that's so. There's a percentage of people, and it's unclear what percentage that is. Some estimates are 10%, some estimates are much lower, some estimates are higher, who deal with a chronic issue post infection. And that may be because the spirochetes live on. There are persister cells, a round body form, a lot of virulence mechanisms for how these bacteria survive. You can put them in a petri dish, put antibiotics, it kills them, leave them in the agar for 21 days, they're regrown. It's crazy. It's wild. But there are some things that have shown to kill them, including not regrowth, and there's some herbs that have been shown to do that. So I like herbal stuff a lot more, I think, than a lot of other providers do in terms of Lyme. Everything has its place there, but I'd say that Lyme and co-infections are certainly a growing issue, certainly an issue that I believe is underappreciated, mimics a lot of other syndromes and symptoms that get misdiagnosed as other things. And so I do believe that it's important as a part of a screening process for many individuals to take a look at, especially if you're dealing with chronic, stubborn mystery things that aren't responding to normal treatments.
Sure. You're so smart. So much information today. Thank you. Tell listeners where they can find you. Where do you practice? What's the name of your practice? Are you on social media? Where can others find you if they want to hear more from you?
Based in Colorado, people can find us online at medicinewithheart.com is the best place. That has a fantastic blog. So if you just want free information, the blog is amazing. We put a lot of time, energy, effort. If I were you, I'd go check that out because there's no cost. It's simple, it's easy, and we put a lot into it. So please check out the blog, medicinewithheart.com, if you want to find out about the practice and how to work with the practice. You can book a call on that site with a staff member, and the staff member is more than happy to chat with you, no matter where you're located, about what options you have for working with us or other clinicians that we know about, and happy to help in that respect if we can. That's the best place. Social and other things are not a big undertaking at this time, so
Sure.
medicinewithheart.com is best.
Awesome. Okay, Dr. Miles, what's your top longevity tip?
Well, I'd say that the top longevity tip
Out of the
is,
100 you gave us.
yeah. Yeah, I mean, the top one is actually the the one that's building self-awareness and going in and finding that place. And it's it's a challenge to talk about that, and how do you do that and where do you go to do that. And but barring that, I think that, just a mindset and an attitude of self-exploration, of experiments, of running experiments, of doing things like, now CGM, there are some consumer CGMs that aren't prescription. You can actually just go buy one, and put it on and see what happens for a couple of weeks. Um, it- Doing these small experiments, making changes, seeing how things change, that kind of attitude and mindset, for wherever you're at. And of course, if you're wanting and able to find support, then finding support from a clinic or place that can do more for you. But if you're starting somewhere, start with mindset, and start with mindset of self-awareness and self-experimentation.
Beautiful. Thank you so much today for all your time, for coming on the show and really helping us with solutions to learn how to, like you were saying, live long and die strong. I just love that. Thank you for sharing your passion, all of the tools, all the tests. I mean, you gave us your wealth of knowledge. You're very intelligent. So thank you for everything that you shared with us today. This was excellent.
Thank you so much for having me, and take care and have a healthy and happy day, everyone.